Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Great Lakes Priorities for Congress and How You Can Help in 2019. I'm Jennifer Caddick, Alliance for the Great Lakes Vice President of Communications and Engagement, and I'll be moderating today's conversation. I'm joined here in Chicago by Alliance for the Great Lakes President and CEO, Joel Bremmeyer, and the Alliance's Vice President for Policy, Molly Flanagan. And our Policy Director, Crystal Davis, is joining us from Ohio. Before we get started, I'd like to go through a few housekeeping items. Here we go. We're excited to have nearly 400 people registered to join us for today's conversation. To limit background noise, all participant lines will be muted for the duration of the webinar. To ask a question, use the question box, as shown here, at any time during the conversation. We'll leave plenty of time for your questions after the presentations, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. Also, later this afternoon, everyone on this call will receive an email with links to a number of helpful resources, including a blog recapping the webinar, our full policy priorities document, information on how to take action, and a recording of today's presentation. And now, to get started, I'll turn things over to Joel Bremmeyer, Alliance for the Great Lakes President and CEO. Joel?
Thank you, Jen, and good morning or good afternoon, depending on what time zone you're in this great, grand region that we live in. I know no matter where you are, it's extraordinarily cold today, and so we're really glad to have everybody on here to talk a little bit about our federal priorities for the coming year. Before we talk about the coming year, I want to step back and start off today's webinar with a little bit of context from last fall. Last year's midterm elections touched nearly every corner of the Great Lakes region. 7 of 8 governorships, 8 Senate seats, all members of the House of Representatives, and hundreds of state and local offices were on the ballot. Hundreds of you downloaded our Protect the Great Lakes This Election Season toolkit, which we shared with you last summer, and got involved. You asked questions of candidates for elected office at all levels. You helped to make the Great Lakes issues part of the conversation leading up to the election. And you made an impact, and we thank you for that. Throughout the region, both Republican and Democratic candidates included Great Lakes issues in their platforms. With the election in early November, the nation and the Great Lakes region saw big changes. The majority in the U.S. House of Representatives flipped from Republican to Democrat. Our region experienced a gubernatorial flip, moving from 5 Republican governors and 3 Democrats to 6 Democratic governors and 2 Republicans. Today, we also have more governors in the Great Lakes region with strong clean water agendas than we did in 2018. Regardless of who's in power throughout the region and the country, we need a continued strengthening of bipartisan support for Great Lakes issues. And that support needs to extend to clean water in all the ways that it matters to the people of the Great Lakes. In the U.S. House, the change in party leadership has put several members of the Great Lakes delegation in high-ranking positions on key committees, including the House Appropriations Committee, which is the powerful committee that controls the federal purse strings and determines how much funding agencies like the U.S. EPA receive each year. A number of supportive Republican Great Lakes members remain in the House as well, and we're fortunate to have Great Lakes champions on both sides of the aisle in the Senate. We have plenty of work ahead to educate our newly elected officials and build momentum for protecting the lakes. The beginning of the new Congress this month has been tumultuous, to say the least. We're now in the midst of the longest government shutdown in history. The partial government shutdown has thrown a wrench into many Great Lakes protection efforts. In Illinois, federal employees should be on the front lines of ensuring Asian carp do not invade Chicago's rivers and Lake Michigan. Back in 2009, half a dozen federal agencies brought a massive response to bear when carp DNA was discovered near the Great Lakes, and today it's not clear who would answer that call. Work to prepare the water monitoring buoys that track harmful algal blooms in Lake Erie is at a standstill. These monitoring stations tell us if the water is safe and track progress toward cleaning up the largest Great Lakes pollution mess in the region. If these buoys aren't launched, we won't have basic information about whether Lake Erie is safe. And earlier in January, the New York Times reported that most of US EPA's 600 pollution inspectors are furloughed. These federal employees do critical frontline work, conducting more than 200 inspections each week to protect public health and safety. Over the last couple of years, the Great Lakes region has been on the receiving end of the Trump administration's proposed massive cuts to Great Lakes programs and basic environmental protections. This shutdown gives us all a preview into the potentially disastrous consequences of these cuts. And while Congress remains open and working, the partial shutdown has thrown a wrench into the budgeting and legislative process for the Great Lakes. Now, there's a lot of uncertainty about how this is going to be resolved, but despite what's happening in Washington, we still need clean water, and we know that our elected leaders are still at their desks in Washington. So today we're laying out priorities for what needs to be done to protect and restore the Great Lakes, and later on, we'll give you tools you can use to tell decision makers how important clean water is to you. Now I'm going to turn things over to two of the Alliance's staff, Molly Flanagan, our Vice President for Policy, and Crystal M.C. Davis, Policy Director.
Thanks, Joel, and hi, everybody. This is Molly, the Vice President for Policy here at the Alliance. Thanks for joining this phone call to learn more about what you can do to support Great Lakes priorities in Congress. With the support of Congress, the Great Lakes region has actually made a lot of progress toward protecting and restoring the lakes. But much more remains to be done. And to that end, the Alliance has identified some key federal policy priorities for 2019 that can make a difference for the lakes and the people who live, work, and play here in the region. I'd like to start by talking to you about an issue that we've talked to you a lot about, Asian carp. Invasive Asian carp were first detected in the Illinois River in the 1990s, and they've been moving steadily closer to Lake Michigan ever since. These are the fish that you've likely seen videos of jumping out of the water and slamming into boaters and water skiers. They also eat a lot and outcompete native fish for food. Asian carp larvae have been detected less than 50 miles from Lake Michigan. In June 2017, a silver carp was found just 9 miles from Lake Michigan. The establishment of Asian carp in the Great Lakes would be catastrophic for the region. They would threaten our $7 billion a year fishing industry and our more than $16 billion a year recreational boating industry. We don't want them in the Great Lakes, and we need Congress and the Army Corps to act quickly to stop them. Later this year, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers will deliver a report to Congress with its final recommendations for additional Asian carp protections at Brandon Road Lock and Dam near Joliet, Illinois. This lock is a logical choke point in the river system, and we need to keep Asian carp from moving beyond the lock in order to have the best chance of keeping them out of Lake Michigan. Congress and the Corps must ensure that funding is available in fiscal year 2020 for the next phase of the Brandon Road project. This phase is called pre-construction engineering and design, and this work has to happen before construction can begin. Members of Congress from the Great Lakes region asked the Corps to make this funding available this year, but it didn't. And we can't afford any more delays. So funding for this part of the project is critical in fiscal year 20 in order to stay on track. Congress must also authorize construction of structural protections at Brandon Road to keep Asian carp from advancing any further toward the Great Lakes, and to ensure that these protections are built as quickly as possible. We really are in a race against the clock to keep Asian carp out of the Great Lakes, and so getting these protections in place at Brandon Road is critical. Next up, I want to talk to you about wastewater infrastructure. We can invest as a region in stronger, more resilient communities by updating outdated and failing wastewater infrastructure across the region. More than 70% of all combined sewers, which collect both sewage and stormwater runoff in the United States, are located right here in the Great Lakes region. Combined sewer overflows during heavy rain events lead to raw or poorly treated sewage being dumped into the lakes. That's gross. Sewage in the lakes is gross. The American Society of Civil Engineers has the 2017 report card for America's infrastructure, and it gave the nation's aging wastewater system a D+. I think we can all agree that a D+ is unacceptable. We need to invest an estimated $271 billion in the nation's wastewater and stormwater systems over the next 25 years. Cities across our region are in great need of investments to update this failing water infrastructure, and often lack the financial resources to pay for these investments. The Clean Water State Revolving Fund provides communities with funding for wastewater infrastructure. We urge Congress to dramatically increase the amount of funding available through the Clean Water State Revolving Fund to at least $5.1 billion. And we support prioritizing funding for financially distressed communities in the form of grants that they don't have to pay back. This program can also be an important source of funding for green infrastructure. Green infrastructure is natural infrastructure like trees and parks that can help control stormwater runoff, reduce combined sewer overflows, and also provide other local environmental, public health, and economic benefits. We want Congress to ensure that funding from the Clean Water State Revolving Fund is available for communities to implement green infrastructure and to operate it and maintain it so that it's effective at managing stormwater and improving water quality into the future. Finally, I want to talk some about the agencies that Joel mentioned that protect and restore the Great Lakes and the funding that they need to do their work. Bipartisan support for the Federal Great Lakes Restoration Initiative has resulted in significant on-the-ground results in all 8 Great Lakes states. The GLRI supports efforts to clean up toxic pollution, restore fish and wildlife habitat, combat invasive species like Asian carp, and also to prevent polluted runoff from farms and cities from reaching the lakes. It's cleaning up the Great Lakes and the communities surrounding the lakes, and it's also having a positive economic benefit to the region. A study released last year showed that every dollar of federal spending on GLRI projects will produce about $3.35 in additional economic activity in the region. That's better than a 3-to-1 return on investment. So we urge Congress to fully fund the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative with at least $300 million annually. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency plays an essential role in safeguarding our Great Lakes water resources. Congress must provide EPA with the funding and policy direction that ensures federal Great Lakes protection efforts don't backslide. There are also a number of other federal agencies and programs that are vital to successfully protecting and restoring the Great Lakes. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration forecasts harmful algal blooms in western Lake Erie each year. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service fights aquatic invasive species and restores habitats and fisheries across the region. The U.S. Geological Survey does important work monitoring water quality. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is critically involved in efforts to keep Asian carp out of the Great Lakes. And the U.S. Department of Agriculture funds programs that help farmers reduce pollution into our rivers and lakes. These agencies and others uphold Great Lakes protections and administer important programs that were targeted for steep cuts in President Trump's proposed budget the last 2 years. The programs these agencies manage are the fundamental building blocks of the largest land and water restoration effort ever undertaken in the Great Lakes. Agencies like the EPA play a critical role in monitoring pollution, enforcing environmental laws, and protecting people's health. We urge Congress to support the work of these agencies individually and collectively in order to protect and restore the Great Lakes and to protect the people who live here. We outline more specifics about these programs in our federal priorities document, and we hope you will join us in urging Congress to support these agencies and programs. And now I'm going to turn things over to Crystal, the Alliance's Policy Director, who's going to cover the rest of our federal priorities for the year.
Great. Thanks, Molly. Good afternoon. Again, I'm Crystal Davis here in Ohio. In addition to Molly's comments on needs associated with wastewater infrastructure, there are also great needs in drinking water infrastructure. In 2017, the American Society of Civil Engineers gave our nation's drinking water system a D, another bad grade, saying that much of our drinking water infrastructure is nearing the end of its useful life. According to the American Water Works Association, an estimated $1 trillion is necessary to repair, replace, and expand drinking water distribution systems over the next 25 years. This figure does not even include the estimated $30 billion that's needed to repair, to replace every lead service line in the country. To address these drinking water infrastructure needs, much more investment is needed at all levels of government. The Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, SRF, allows communities to invest in outdated and failing drinking water infrastructure. America's Water Infrastructure Act of 2018 reauthorized the Drinking Water SRF for the first time in more than 2 decades. While it increased the authorization for the Drinking Water SRF, Funding still needs to be increased dramatically to better meet the needs of communities across the region and nation. Specifically, we urge Congress to provide at least $3.5 billion to the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, which is triple the amount provided in fiscal year 2018 appropriations. We strongly support policies that ensure access to safe, clean, affordable drinking water for everyone in the country. We encourage progressive payment systems that support long-term infrastructure investment without crippling low-income households. For instance, funding for financially distressed communities will be prioritized in the form of grants via the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. And we support the establishment of federal low-income water and sewage assistance programs that's similar to the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program to help low-income households afford their water and sewage bills. And again, it is worth repeating that we support Congress spending at least $3.5 billion on the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. It's triple the funding provided in FY18 appropriations, and it's funding that is needed across the region and across the nation to upgrade failing drinking water infrastructure. Nutrient pollution, which fuels massive harmful algal blooms, is a significant threat to the region's drinking water, quality of life, and economic well-being. Runoff from agricultural lands is the largest contributor to pollution in western Lake Erie, the area most impacted by this pollution. In August 2014, nearly 500,000 people in communities around western Lake Erie experienced drinking water bans ranging from 2 days to more than a week as a result of toxic algae. Unfortunately, harmful algal blooms are now the norm in western Lake Erie and in other parts of the Great Lakes, including Green Bay, Wisconsin, and Saginaw Bay, Michigan. Specifically, we're urging the Great Lakes State and U.S. EPA to adopt a Clean Water Act Total Maximum Daily Load, or TMDL, for phosphorus and nitrogen pollution for the western Lake Erie Basin. And we urge Congress to support a variety of funding programs that can help reduce runoff from agricultural lands, including full funding for Farm Bill conservation programs, water quality monitoring and reporting programs in Lake Erie and Green Bay, and the Land and Water Conservation Fund, just to name a few. Now I'll pass it back to Joel.
Thank you, Crystal and Molly, for those details. And as they both said, you can find more of that on our website in our full federal priorities document. So I know many of you took action to make the Great Lakes and clean water a priority during the election last year. Now it's time to make sure we continue to educate those who were elected on the issues you care about and to hold them accountable for protecting clean water. I know some of you on this webinar are financial supporters of the Alliance, for which we are thankful. This allows our staff to do work like visiting Washington and educating members of Congress, but we also depend on you communicating your support for the Great Lakes directly to your elected officials. You can take action right now at greatlakes.org/takeaction. When you visit this website, you will find a letter to Congress that you can personalize and send directly to your member of Congress and senators. Please take a few minutes and send a letter today. Your personal voice is what your elected officials need to hear. Now I'm going to turn things back to Jennifer Caddick, who's going to manage our question and answer session for the rest of our time today.
Thanks so much, Joel, Molly, and Crystal. So I apologize earlier, we showed you information on the screen about how to submit questions, but we weren't actually sharing our screen. So here's that information again. You should see a questions box to the right of your screen, and you can enter a question at any time. As I mentioned, due to the large volume of people on this call, we are keeping all lines muted, so this is a way to ask any questions. I guess I'll start us off with just sort of a broad question, which is one that actually I've received already a little bit. And I'll maybe toss this over to Molly and Crystal. And that's just asking, certainly we've talked a lot about the federal government here, but are these policy priorities also the same at the state level? Crystal, would you like to start on that?
Sure. Our federal priorities will also be vitally important at the state and local levels as well. with infrastructure, for instance, it's imperative that in addition to federal investment, there is state dollars being allocated for infrastructure upgrades, because we've discussed just how vast the gaps are in terms of funding. And so we need all hands on deck, and we need to adopt that approach. And we will be looking for investments from all levels of government.
Thanks, Crystal. We have a question from Mackenzie, who asks, how will the government shutdown really impact the safety of the Great Lakes? Joel, maybe you could take that question.
Thanks. Yeah, when I think about this, I think about the effects of sort of the long-term decline of agency work, and you don't necessarily see those effects right away. If somebody doesn't come to work for one day or even a week, you may not see the impacts. But over time, when we start to see the delays in inspection and enforcement against polluters, we start to see the impacts of lack of monitoring for whether water is safe. And you start to see, in the worst case scenario, an inability to respond to a crisis, such as the discovery of a new invasive species or a chemical spill in one of the Great Lakes. And those are the places where the rubber really meets the road. What we need to keep focused on is we can't afford to get to that crisis point. There's already going to be damage done and delays to long-term work to protect the Great Lakes as a result of this shutdown. The last thing we need is to get to a crisis point where we're not in a position to respond to protect people in the Great Lakes. And so it's important that we get our federal agencies back to work.
Thanks, Joel. I have a question about related to the Asian carp issue from Corinne. And so, Molly, I'll toss this one to you. And the question is asking about, is the idea of sort of reversing the flow of the Chicago River more or less expensive than the ongoing stopgap measures, such as those you mentioned earlier at Brandon Road, Lock and Dam here in Illinois?
Yeah, so shutting down the Chicago area waterway system and basically sending the water back the way that it used to go, which was flowing into Lake Michigan as opposed to away from Lake Michigan, is really expensive. It is the most effective way to keep Asian carp out of the Great Lakes. Actually figuring out a way to physically separate the Great Lakes and Mississippi River basins would protect not only the Great Lakes, but also the Mississippi River Basin from invasive species that might move in either direction. But it is incredibly expensive. And part of the reason it's expensive is that it would require reworking all of the city of Chicago's plumbing to make sure that flooding isn't worsened and that water that is returned to the Great Lakes is of a high enough quality to go back into Lake Michigan, which is the source of drinking water for millions and millions of people. It's also an idea that is very strongly opposed by the shipping industry and by industries that move, different products on the waterways. And for that reason, and sort of the challenges with moving that idea forward right now, we have focused on getting protections put in place at Brandon Road Lock and Dam that would allow goods to continue to move through that lock, but increase protections against Asian carp moving into Lake Michigan. What it won't do is protect the Mississippi River Basin from invasive species moving from the Great Lakes, or stop a number of other, smaller invasive species that might be able to make it through the lock into the Great Lakes. And so, reversing the flow of the Chicago River is a very long-term goal. I think it's something that people will continue to explore and try to figure out, whether there are steps that can be taken to protect the city of Chicago and also, protect businesses and protect the Great Lakes. But right now, our focus is really on getting these protections in place at Brandon Road. And it's what we're asking Congress to focus on over the next few years.
Thanks, Molly. I actually have a follow-up question to that for you, and it's from Nancy. And this is a common question we hear from folks about the process that the Army Corps of Engineers and Congress is going through to put up barriers or additional protection measures, rather, at the Brandon Road Lock and Dam. And a concern we often hear is about the pace of this project. It's just been very slow process. And I'm wondering if you could comment on that and, the efforts that the Alliance is undertaking to remind Congress of how important this issue is.
Yeah, the pace of this project is like, well, I was going to say glacial, but glaciers are actually melting pretty fast. It's more like continental drift, I guess. It's taken a long time to get to this point where the Corps is almost ready to make a final recommendation to Congress. And even once that happens, the Corps is estimating that it will take about a decade to finish building everything that it's proposing at Brandon Road Lock and Dam. And so that's one of the reasons why it's so important that Congress provide the funding that the Corps needs now in order for the Corps to take its next steps. It also means that some of the efforts that the state of Illinois and federal agencies like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service are doing harvesting and fishing Asian carp out of the Great Lakes continue to be important to reduce the pressure of those fish to try to move beyond Brandon Road Lock and Dam. But yeah, we're talking about a long time frame. It's one of the reasons that monitoring the location of Asian carp is so important, because if for some reason we find additional evidence of Asian carp beyond Brandon Road Lock and Dam, then I think that would cause the Alliance and others to support some other immediate actions to make sure the Asian carp don't make it any further. But in the meantime, we need Congress to give the Corps the money to take the next steps to keep this on track so that we can try to keep Asian carp out of the Great Lakes.
Thanks, Molly. I'll just chime in here quickly. We have a couple questions about asking if there's going to be any handouts or ways to take action after this. You can visit our Action Center right now, which is greatlakes.org/takeaction, and you'll find an action alert there where you can customize a letter to send to your members of Congress. So we urge everyone on this call to take action today. You also receive an email after this webinar with a link to the recording, as well as a copy of our full federal priorities document, along with several other resources. So keep an eye out for that later this afternoon. The next question I have, I'm going to give to you, Joel, and it's a question from Tony Briscoe at the Chicago Tribune. And he's asking if there are any important research programs or efforts in the Great Lakes that have been suspended or delayed as a result of the shutdown. Can you address that question, Joel?
Sure. Thanks, Tony. When you hear about an environmental problem in the press, for example, for the first time, oftentimes that problem has been uncovered as a result of long-term projects that collect data about what's going on with our air, water, and land. And a great deal, the vast majority of the funding for that data collection comes from the federal government. So when money doesn't come into the Great Lakes region for that kind of monitoring, there's a risk that we lose track of environmental problems that are affecting people around the Great Lakes. To give you an example, one from the top of my comments today, in western Lake Erie, we've got a situation where every summer harmful algal blooms, some of them toxic, are impairing recreation, making it, rendering drinking water potentially unsafe for millions of people. And there's a lot of federal dollars being invested in tracking the pollution going into Lake Erie to determine whether or not there's going to be a toxic algae bloom and whether or not we're making progress on the major commitment to reduce pollution to Lake Erie by 40% that was made in 2015. Without our federal agency staff at work continuing that data collection and preparing for the next season of data collection, we could lose track of whether we're actually making progress, and even more importantly, we may not have the tools in place to be able to communicate with people as to whether their water is safe. And that's just a risk that is, the monitoring costs actually are vanishingly small relative to the amount of money that we're investing in actually trying to clean up the problem. And so it just doesn't make any sense to put the brakes on those monitoring efforts. We also know that there's a huge body of research being generated around the issue that Molly just spoke about, Asian carp prevention. And again, a lot of the funding to support that research and tracking the locations of those carp or potential locations of the invasive species around the Great Lakes is coming from the federal government. And so right now, we are getting closer and closer to a risk of flying blind and not actually knowing what's going on in the water. So again, the sooner these programs get back online, the sooner we can actually focus on solving the problems and knowing that we're making progress.
Thanks, Joel. I have a question here asking about, who exactly the Alliance is connecting with, rather than just saying the Congress as a whole. In the House and Senate, there are a lot of different committees and caucuses, for instance, the Congressional Black Caucus. Does the Alliance work in any way with these various groups directly? And Crystal, I don't know if you'd like to tackle that question.
Sure. Yes, we have plans to specifically engage the Congressional Black Caucus. CBC is the largest it's ever been, with 52 members. Many are from Great Lakes states, and a majority of them have at least an appreciation for water issues. And so we've shared our federal priorities document with them, and we'll co-host a Congressional Black Caucus member staff briefing in conjunction with Healing Our Waters Coalition's Great Lakes Days in Washington, D.C. this March. I think Molly can probably speak more specifically about the other task forces that we are engaging.
Yeah, so another group of legislators that we work with in Congress is called the House and Senate Great Lakes Task Forces. And in the Senate Great Lakes Task Force is led by Senators Stabenow and Portman from Michigan and Ohio. And then in the House, it's Congresswoman Capter from Ohio and Congressman Huizenga from Michigan and Congressman Duffy from Wisconsin. And then a number of other members of the House and Senate are members of these task forces. And in fact, if you look up Great Lakes Task Forces on the internet, you can find the list of members. And one thing you can ask your member of Congress to do is, if they're not on that list, ask them to join the Great Lakes Task Force, because it's a great way for us to be able to work with members of Congress that are prioritizing the Great Lakes enough to be part of this sort of special task force. And we work with the leadership and the members of those task forces, along with a number of other, as Joel mentioned, leaders on the Appropriations Committee, on the Environment and Public Works Committee, on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committees, to make sure that Great Lakes priorities are also priorities for members of Congress from the Great Lakes region and for the nation.
Thanks, Molly. Our next question is from Bob, and he asks one that I know is on a lot of people's minds over the years in the Great Lakes, and that's the issue of ballast water. Ballast water has traditionally been sort of one of the main pathways for new invasive species coming into the Great Lakes, and he's asking if the ballast water issue is a priority for this Congress. Do you want to tackle that one, Molly?
So last session, Congress passed legislation, the Vessel Incidental Discharge Act, that changes the way that ballast water is regulated in this country. The good news is it keeps those regulations under the Environmental Protection Agency and under the Clean Water Act. The bad news is that it removes the state's abilities largely to pass stronger protections against invasive species. So at this point, what we actually need Congress to do is appropriate $50 million for the Great Lakes and Lake Champlain Invasive Species Program. That would provide funding for monitoring and response efforts if new invasive species are found in the Great Lakes, or to help us find new invasive species in the Great Lakes. It would also help with the development of new technologies to treat ballast water. And so that is the big thing we need Congress to do this session, is to put money into that program. And then the other thing that the Alliance will be doing is looking at that new law and determining what opportunities there are to work with EPA and to work with the states to make sure that we're doing the best that we can to protect the Great Lakes from new invasions from ballast water.
Thanks, Molly. That was helpful. We have a question from Helena, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, asking about the different sources of pollution into the lake. So she mentions that Michigan is a main sort of industrial center with auto manufacturing and other industries possibly releasing pollution into Lake Michigan, and other communities around the region have sewer overflows, which Molly mentioned earlier, and I agree they are gross. And the question is, what federal funding is allocated to local water authorities and other authorities to address these sources of pollution into the lakes? And I think there's also concerns around the partial government shutdown as far as regulating those sources. So Joel, do you want to tackle that one?
Yeah, thanks. And I want to emphasize that point that Jen just made. You know, we can't lose sight of the fact that our federal employees, the day-to-day staff, are on the front lines and making sure that entities like water utilities, sewage treatment plants, industrial facilities are in compliance with federal and federal law. And those federal laws are designed to protect water from being polluted in the first place. And so we need to make sure that basic day-to-day work is happening. This question focuses on, you know, one part of the chain of protecting water quality, and that is protecting source water. You know, making sure that industrial facilities, sewage plants, you know, cities can operate while not polluting the source water that we all depend on for drinking water. And that's critically important. Funding from funds like the ones we discussed, the Clean Water and Drinking Water State Revolving Funds, are available to assist communities with making sure that they come into compliance with those laws. And of course, the private sector is responsible and obligated for complying with those laws itself as a condition of their ability to operate. So that part of the water protection chain certainly depends on federal funding, but we also want to make sure that we're not just focused on protecting source water, but we're also focused on making sure that people have access to safe and clean drinking water at the tap and wherever they need it in their daily lives. And federal funding also plays a significant role in making sure that that's possible by supporting the replacement of the pipes that underpin cities and towns all over the Great Lakes region.
Thanks, Joel. I have a question. The next question is from Dan, and he's asking about all the different programs that are being used to reduce the pollution from agricultural lands that gets into, that leads to the harmful algal blooms, in particularly in western Lake Erie. And he notes that there are a variety of programs in our federal priorities. As Crystal detailed, we talk a lot about some of the, both the voluntary programs as well as advocating for regulatory programs. And Crystal, I don't know if you could talk about the role that both of those approaches can play in helping to improve the situation in western Lake Erie.
Sure. I think it's kind of like I talked about earlier in the webinar here. We really need an all-hands-on-deck approach. And so while we appreciate voluntary measures to encourage best management practices, that also needs to be coupled with mandatory regulations that require everyone to do the right thing. We understand that what happens on agricultural lands affects us all because we're all impacted by what happens there, and we're all impacted by the water. And so it really requires both approaches to work hand in hand. We know that we prefer mandatory actions and mandatory regulations so that we can clean up the lake quicker. And so that's what we will be carrying, the message that we'll be carrying to state legislatures throughout the Great Lakes state.
Thanks, Crystal. The next question we have is from Danielle, who's asking about WOTUS, which is the Waters of the U.S. rule, and asking if the Alliance has a specific position on that issue. Molly, would you be able to explain what WOTUS is to our listeners and what our position is?
Yeah, so the WOTUS rule, or Waters of the U.S., has to do with which waters and wetlands and water bodies are regulated under the Clean Water Act. And President Trump's EPA is proposing a significant rollback of the water bodies that would be regulated under the Clean Water Act. And so we're opposed to that effort. We have significant concerns about the number of wetlands and small streams that would be left unprotected if this rule were to move forward and be finalized. And all of those small wetlands and small streams act as kidneys for the Great Lakes, and they're really important in terms of filtering out pollutants before they reach the Great Lakes. And so it's critical that these waterways continue to be regulated under the Clean Water Act so that we're protecting the Great Lakes and the larger rivers and streams across the Great Lakes. We need protections for all of those water bodies to protect drinking water and to protect water for wildlife that depend on them.
Thanks, Molly. The next question I have is from John, and he's asking one, which we often get from a lot of folks, and that's about our whatever connections we might have, both as a nonprofit and also our government agencies with Canadian entities. Obviously, the Great Lakes are a binational waterway shared both by the United States and Canada. And so, Joel, maybe I'll punt this over to you. The question is, what efforts does your organization make to partner with or lobby the Canadian government, and how receptive are Canadian government and nonprofit groups like yourself there to joint action?
Sure. So as most, if not everybody on this call knows, we are part of a binational water system with the country of Canada, and that's one of the things that makes the Great Lakes unique. Back in 2017, when the outlines of the Trump administration's environmental agenda were becoming clear, one of the first things that the Canadian and Ontario and Quebec governments did was to register their concern with these potential rollbacks here in the United States, because they share a vision of the Great Lakes as a critical and protected water resource for all the people of Canada. And so we know that the priority is there. Having said that, the Canadian government had not been making the kinds of investments at the level that the U.S. government had been under the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. And I think that over the last couple of years, they've reviewed their own programs and have really started the process of looking into what would it take to make a significant new commitment to the Great Lakes at the federal level in Canada. And to that end, there has been a new Great Lakes initiative underway now for a few months that is bringing together some of the brightest minds in environmental and water protection in Canada to talk about what a vision for Great Lakes protection at the federal level in Canada could look like, what the next phase of that would be. And there's a number of great groups and, as I said, great thinkers involved in that effort. So I'm inspired by that, and I'm really hopeful to see what that brings. And I've had some very promising conversations with members of the Canadian government over the last couple of years that indicates that they really are committed to the idea of strengthening their own commitment to the Great Lakes. There is, I can't get into great detail right now, but there is a vast array, as there is here in the United States, there's a vast array of organizations working from everything from the individual neighborhood block level all the way up to the corridors of Parliament in Canada, and then the provincial governments focused on clean water issues. And so there's lots more to learn about that, but we've seen some great moves recently by the Canadian government and their commitment to the Great Lakes, and hopefully that'll result in greater protections down the line.
Thanks, Joel. And I'd like to pull in Crystal into that question as well, because I know that there have been some key important agreements between the United States and Canada, or at least the states and provinces around Lake Erie, which is an issue that Crystal works closely on. Crystal, would you like to comment on that agreement and that partnership?
Sure. The governors and the Premier of Canada have made an agreement and a commitment to reducing phosphorus by 40%. And so we're getting reports on progress or lack thereof, and definitely working with Canada to try to amplify best management practice and work towards achieving those goals that have been outlined.
Thanks, Crystal. I have a couple of questions about Line 5, which is the pipeline that goes underneath the Straits of Mackinac. So I think there's sort of two different tacks on this. One is sort of what's the Alliance's position on Line 5? There's been a lot of proposals to shut it down or other alternatives around that. And are there any concerns regarding the shutdown if something terrible were to happen on the pipeline? Joel, would you like to answer?
Yeah, so we've advocated for the shutdown and decommissioning of Line 5, and there's a great chorus of organizations working in Michigan to that end. And so we've also advocated for a sustainable alternative that doesn't put the Great Lakes at further risk. Late last year, there was a process that jammed through a proposal to relocate a pipeline under the Straits of Mackinac to a tunnel, and there was some really problematic process around this, and it was done at the last minute of the Snyder administration in Michigan. And as a result, one of the first moves that Governor Whitmer did when she took office was to engage her Attorney General on a complete review of that process, and hopefully that process will lead to the eventual shutdown of Line 5. So in the bigger picture, there is a network of pipelines that crisscross the Great Lakes region, carrying oil and natural gas and chemicals and a variety of substances that you would not want spilled in our water. And so, we anticipate that for the foreseeable future, there are going to be that network of pipelines is going to continue to run. But the reality is we can't do that in a way that puts our water at risk. And so we need to find a sustainable alternative to Line 5 that doesn't actually put the Great Lakes at risk. And we know that the process that Michigan went through at the end of last year isn't going to provide the answer to that.
Thanks, Joel. I have a question from Blair asking about Foxconn, which is a huge industrial facility proposed in southeast Wisconsin. And there's been a lot of controversy about that facility's proposal to draw water from Lake Michigan. And so Molly, Blair is asking about the status of Foxconn's potential Lake Michigan water diversion in Wisconsin. Do we have any updates on that?
So Foxconn is located, its actual facility is located such that it is not 100% within the Great Lakes Basin Divide, which means in order for it to get water and operate, it has to divert some water outside of the Great Lakes. And generally, that's not allowed under the Great Lakes Compact, but there are exceptions, and Foxconn fits under one of those exceptions. And so it has approval from the state of Wisconsin to divert water from Lake Michigan to use in its manufacturing process. And then it has to return all of the water that it takes out, except for the part that it actually uses in its manufacturing, back to Lake Michigan. There have been concerns raised about water quality. There have been concerns raised about air quality having to do with this plant. At this point, it is moving forward. There are lawsuits that are challenging any number of things around the Foxconn plant. I will note that the entity, the Great Lakes Compact Council, Governor Evers from Wisconsin is the new chair of that body, and Governor DeWine is the new vice chair of that body. And so we are hopeful that this new set of governors that we have in the region are going to work together to look at how they handle proposals like Foxconn that don't actually require the entire region to come together and weigh in. It's just up to one state. To think about, how there could be more of a regional process in terms of reviewing these types of diversions that actually are allowed under the Great Lakes Compact. And so, Foxconn is broken ground and moving forward, and we are looking for opportunities that the region can work better together in the future in reviewing these types of proposals.
Thanks, Molly. We have another question about Asian carp, which maybe I'll have to go to Joel. It's from Christopher, and this is a question we hear a lot about often, and an issue, part of the Asian carp issue where there are certainly pros and cons. And Christopher is asking about if there's any talk or proposals for creating subsidies for Asian carp fishing and creating some sort of a commercial market for the fish. Joel or Molly, would you like to answer that question?
Yeah, Christopher, thanks for your question. Actually, that's the exact opposite of what I would like to see happen, and here's why. Harvesting these carp and knocking back the population numbers is an effective deterrent to them invading the Great Lakes. When you have fewer fish swimming around, it creates a lower risk that they can actually advance toward a new water body, which in this case is a good thing. However, and I will mention, all that harvesting is actually being subsidized federally right now, and that harvest needs to continue while we're getting a better solution in place. However, in terms of creating a commercial market, we're concerned about that because we don't actually want there to be advocates for maintaining a population of invasive species that's putting the country's waters at risk. Keep in mind that the Asian carp problem is not just one that's facing the Great Lakes, but it's facing many other parts of the United States. And a commercial fishery creates supporters for that commercial fishery. And frankly, maintaining a population of Asian carp for harvest is at odds with not just the protection of the Great Lakes, but with the restoration of native fish and sporting opportunities in the Mississippi River Basin. A lot of the Mississippi River states are very concerned about that as well. So we'd like to knock those populations back. But we really don't think that maintaining a sustained commercial fishery that could actually be at odds with the goal of preventing Asian carp invasions.
And this is Molly, and I agree with everything that Joel just said, but I need to make a correction on my last statement about Foxconn. Evers and DeWine are chair and co-chair and vice chair of the Conference of Great Lakes Governors and Premiers. The Great Lakes Compact Council is actually led by Governor Holcomb from Indiana, with the vice chair being Governor Whitmer from Michigan.
Thanks, Molly. We have just sort of a broad question about the impacts of climate change on the Great Lakes. But I'll narrow that down, and I think that impacts a number of the issues that we've talked today and are sort of reasons why we need some of these critical funding programs in place and monitoring programs. And two areas that it impacts is sort of our wastewater infrastructure. Under climate change scenarios, we'll see heavier, bigger storms, which tend to overload our wastewater and create those very gross sewage overflows. And then we also know that that's a challenge and certainly a factor in the algal blooms in western Lake Erie. So, Molly, maybe I'll have you start to talk about why some of these programs are so important as we deal with the impacts of climate change, and then we can have Crystal chime in on Lake Erie.
Yeah, as the region, and Jen, you said it really well, as the region is faced with climate change and, potentially fluctuating lake levels and these bigger, stronger storms, we are going to continue to face challenges with water quality, sewer overflows, flooding concerns in communities. It's one of the reasons we need more investment in our wastewater and stormwater infrastructure. It's also a reason why we'd like to see more investment in green infrastructure in the region, in that natural infrastructure that can help hold back water and then slowly release it into the Great Lakes. Because it can help with combined sewer overflows, it can help with water quality, it can help with community flooding. But we also need investment in that hard infrastructure, the gray infrastructure of wastewater treatment systems, so that they can better handle influxes of stormwater and better manage the treatment of that water before it's released into the Great Lakes. It's why the Clean Water State Revolving Fund is so critical, and funding for that program is so important.
Thanks, Molly. With that, I think we're going to wrap it up. Oh, go ahead, Crystal. Did you want to chime in?
I was just also going to say that, these are some of the things that you can see for yourself, and this is how we actually bring in non-environmentalists. Combined sewer overflows, seeing trash on the beach. These are the things that people see and get connected to our issues and are so important. And so this is why we need folks to go to the State House and advocate for additional funding for infrastructure, and again, at all levels of government. And so just as Molly outlined, why it's important and related to federal funding. We need that same funding on the state level as well. And so we're asking that all of our supporters, regardless of your industry and what area you work in, because you see the impacts of this on a daily basis, go and talk to your legislators about how this is impacting your neighborhood and your everyday lives.
Great. Thanks for that, Crystal. Thank you so much, everybody. We're going to wrap this up for today. Thanks so much for joining us and listening in and for asking a ton of great questions. As I said before, you'll all receive email later today with many of the resources mentioned in the conversation today, and we encourage you to visit greatlakes.org/takeaction to send a letter to your elected officials today urging them to support these priorities. Thank you so much and have a great day.